Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about the carbon cycle. And the carbon cycle is one of these topics that we could either go really in depth with or we could keep it kind of simple. And for our class, we're going to keep it pretty simple. But I just want to point out that this is something, if you just take a look at this diagram right here, that is really just encompasses a lot of science. And we could take each of those terms listed, right, and go into all of the in-depth science behind them. But what we're going to do for this class is sort of look at the overarching story about the carbon cycle. And so let's get started. You might have heard this term carbon-based life. We are carbon-based life. It's an extremely important element. But this carbon element and other elements for that matter, they don't just appear and disappear. For the most part, they've been here since the beginning of time. And in terms of disappearing and reappearing, they don't, but what they do is they get recycled from one form into the next. So in order to truly sort of show you the importance of carbon, let's take a look at some of the important molecules you'll find carbon in. First of all, carbon is really sort of unique because of its ability to create a lot of bonds with other uh, elements. And so here you look at a carbon molecule that is bonded to another carbon molecule. But you can see that the carbon molecule has the ability to make three other bonds. Um, and so without getting too much into the chemistry that I don't really need you to know, just understand that carbon has the ability to make four separate bonds. And what you can see is that carbon can also easily bind to carbon. And what you'll find is that in a lot of molecules, you'll get what is called a carbon backbone or a carbon-carbon link backbone. And basically what that means is that a lot of the most important molecules that are basically determine that what can life can survive basically are built off of these carbon-carbon backbones. And so let's take a look at just some really important molecules. This first one up here, this is an amino acid, and you can see this is one of many different types of amino acids, but you can see this carbon-carbon backbone here. And you can see that this carbon has linked with this side chain group, a hydrogen and a nitrogen, and this has a double bond to an oxygen and another oxygen. So you can see that carbon is the main backbone here, and we know that amino acids make up proteins, and proteins are integral for structural support and energy as well. And so um, proteins, amino acids that build up proteins are really important. Here's adenosine triphosphate, which is ATP. You can see the chemical structure here is C10H16 N5 O13P3. But we have a carbon backbone that makes up this ATP. And remember, ATP is the sort of cellular dollar or the cellular energy buck or whatever you want to call it, but it's the energy that cells use to perform cellular processes. Here is this really if you look at more molecules, you'll figure out that this ring structure is really sort of a common structure you'll find that's basically energetically stable for carbons to bond to each other in this sort of ring structure. You can see it down here as well as in ATP. This is just glucose, a very simple sugar. It's a 6-carbon molecule. And glucose, parts of sugars are also parts of nucleotides. And when you string together nucleotides, you get nucleic acids, like DNA, for example, which is a double-stranded molecule. And we remember that DNA is basically the genetic code for how life is set up. And so what you can see is that carbon is really the basis of all life, and that's really why we're called carbon-based life. Um, so let's talk about the carbon cycle. How does carbon cycle through our biosphere? And really the best place to start is up in the atmosphere. All of the carbon in our atmosphere is made up of CO2, so that's a carbon with two oxygens. Um, as important as carbon dioxide is to our atmosphere, it only makes up a really small percentage, so 0.04% of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide. Now that changes in is increasing with effects of human-created climate change, but even still, it's at a very small percentage as compared to like nitrogen, which is like 70% of our atmosphere. Now, the reason that carbon dioxide is so integral is because of the other things that we're going to talk about in this lecture. Um, but when we talk about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's in a gaseous form, it's in an inorganic form, and it's in an unusable form. And so, really, the first thing to start is you have plants or any organism that can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in its gaseous form and do carbon fixation or fixing carbon during photosynthesis. And basically, what carbon fixation is, if you remember when we talked about photosynthesis in sort of really a quick little part of one lecture, is that you take carbon dioxide in its unusable gaseous form and you fix or basically attach it to another carbon molecule, and you make at the end sugar or any other molecule that's carbon based. But for the most part, we're talking about sugar when we talk about photosynthesis. So you can see carbon dioxide goes in along with the sunlight that's needed for the energy, and you can produce molecules that make either sugars in these fruits or structural proteins for the plant body itself. And so plants had this unique ability to take that unusable carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere and create organic carbon molecules or carbon that is organic. And that's carbon fixation. Now, we know that organisms that are heterotrophic, or organisms that cannot make their own energy by using sunlight and carbon dioxide, have to achieve or get their nutrition by either eating this plant body or by eating other organisms. And so before we get into that, I just want to show you that when you think about this big sequoia tree or this redwood tree, look at how large it is. This is obviously a full-grown male and a full-grown female adult. All of this plant structure, all of this plant body was once unusable gaseous CO2 that they were able to take from the atmosphere and make into this plant body. And so I just think that's really interesting. If you think about it in sort of this abstract way, is you basically are being created out of thin air almost, right? Like you could almost call it that, where the gas is this invisible, you never know it was there, a CO2 that is then produced into these proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates, and other sugars that make up this plant body. And so I just think that's really cool and just something that kind of blows my mind. But when we talk about organisms that can't produce their own energy using photosynthesis, they of course have to eat that plant body or other organisms to achieve that. Now, when you metabolize either this nice salad that this cat is apparently enjoying, or I don't really know if it's enjoying it, or this tortoise who's eating this plant, that once they metabolize that, they create their own body structure and their lipids and proteins that create up their body, and the energy, the ATP that they use to create do their cellular processes. When an organism is eating a plant or an organism eats another organism, they metabolize that. And in somewhat of a little small part of a cycle that is a cycle in and of itself, when you metabolize some either plant body or animal body, you produce wastes. And one of those wastes is the carbon dioxide that you exhale, okay? And so that is a cycle in and of itself. The carbon dioxide starts in the atmosphere, is taken up by these plant bodies that either get consumed by this organism or an organism that consumes this organism, and then the CO2 returns to the atmosphere through exhalation or just through metabolism. And so I think that's the first part of this cycle, that is a cycle of itself, a really quick cycle. Another example of how carbon dioxide from the atmosphere gets absorbed is into the oceans. And from the oceans, it gets absorbed and creates this carbonate. And so here is what happens under normal levels of atmospheric CO2. You get carbon dioxide that dissolves into the water, and it combines with the water to make carbonic acid. Now, this carbonic acid molecule breaks up into what is called bicarbonate, and attaches to protons, or basically hydrogen ions, to form calcium carbonate. Now, calcium carbonate is part of the shells and part of the coral structure that we talked about when we talked about corals. Now, under a normal pH of ocean water, which is about 8.2, which is more to the basic side of the pH scale. If you remember, the pH scale goes from like 0 to 14. The closer you are to 0, the more acidic you are, and the closer you are to 14, the more basic you are. And so under normal pHs, you get this pretty healthy balance of creating calcium carbonate that organisms can use for their shells or for their calcium carbonate structures like these corals, and this bicarbonate. However, as we are producing more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere from man-made events or man-made climate change, what we get is more of an acidic effect in the ocean. So the pH is lowered and it's more acidic than is normal. And what happens is when you're more acidic, there are more hydrogen ions, or positively charged hydrogen ions, that makes this normal chemical reaction go towards this bicarbonate. And this bicarbonate molecule is unusable for organisms. And so instead of going this way and interacting with this carbonate, making calcium carbonate, which is needed for the shells and the coral, we get much less of this that's usable for organisms and more of this which is unusable for organisms. That leads to thin shells and dead coral. And so this is actually a really big problem of the list of many big problems that we get when we get elevated levels of atmospheric CO2 from man-made climate change. And so we will get maybe more into that a little bit later, but it was just a side note. But really, when we talk about our carbon cycle, this is a big part of it, where the ocean becomes a big sink for the carbon dioxide. A sink is where a lot of it goes into. Okay, the next part of the cycle is the formation of fossil fuels. And so remember when I said if an organism was to die and never be broken down, all of the organic material, all of the carbon that is used to make up this body of either the plants or the animals would be stuck to those bodies. And luckily, we have decomposers like fungi and bacteria that can release that back into the environment into a usable form. Well, that's true. A lot of that does happen, but some of it stays within the body of the dead organism or the dead plant or the dead animal. And what happens is plants and animals will die, and they might sink to the bottom of the sea, or and if we're talking about in the sea, or they'll just be covered up by soil. And as we go, this is going to be over millions of years, okay? So we're talking about a really, really long time. But as this continues, the plants and animals that died, that layer will be continued to get covered with more sediments like mud and dirt. And so over much, much more time, more sediment will create pressure, and this increased pressure will compress the dead plants and animals into oil. And so if you know what oil is, that's what we use to burn, to run the things that we need to run. And then eventually you'll get the oil that'll move up through porous rocks and eventually will form into a reservoir, which we then drill down into the earth to get fossil fuels to burn, okay? Now, obviously, this is another way that we sort of increase this cycle where we take the carbon that was made into that oil, that fossil fuel, and we burn it. And we get a release of energy that we can use to run our cars, run our factories, run the power that goes to your house, all sorts of things that we use these fossil fuels for. But you get an extreme amount of carbon going back in forms of CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, notice that this is a completely man-made portion of this cycle. Normally, if there were no humans involved in this process, this wouldn't occur at the rate at which it does. Now, and that's not to say that it won't occur, because there is the natural process by which this can occur, where you get explosions from volcanic activity that releases a lot of stored carbon back into the atmosphere. Now, how often does this happen? Not a lot, right? Once every hundreds or maybe thousands of years, you'll get a volcanic activity, whereas this is happening every day, nonstop, daily, many parts of the world. And so you can see where this idea of this man-made accelerated climate change occurs because really, I mean, this is sort of irrefutable evidence of this happening, right? This is not something that's natural. This wouldn't be happening at this rate without our input, okay? And so I think this is where I'm going to stop. I think we've sort of talked about the really basic level of understanding of the carbon cycle. And so let's just take maybe one more look at it, okay? Um, Things that we talked about. Well, in the atmosphere, we've got carbon dioxide, and that is going to be taken up into these plant bodies and made usable through photosynthesis. At some point, consumption happens where an organism that is not an autotroph eats the plant body that was created through this photosynthesis. Okay, that's happening twice here. Then this organism could die and decompose, and through time be made into fossil fuels, which are released through human influence, through combustion of fossil fuels. But let's just say you made a campfire. That burning of this plant body also releases some amount of carbon into the atmosphere. When you, as a heterotrophic organism, eat, produce the energy, you create waste and respire or breathe, and respiration releases more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We talked about carbon dioxide that dissolves into the oceans and either produces calcium carbonate that's used by shelled organisms or the corals, or if this ocean becomes too acidic, is made into an unusable form that causes these shelled organisms a lot of struggles. And so I think we've really talked about everything that I want to talk about here. The next lecture that we'll go through is the water cycle. But take a look at this slideshow again and maybe copy down all of the ways in which we talked about how the carbon cycle works. All right, I'll see you next time.